2-foot one.
Well, hello and welcome to, I think this is the third edition of the Frasers Perspective podcast series. My name's Daniel Goodfellow, and in this series I'm speaking to a number of people across the Frasers business to really try and understand, I guess, what it's like to develop not just residential property, but all kinds of property in Australia in 2018. We have rapidly developing cities, increasing population, and these conversations are designed to try and understand a little bit more deeply some of those issues that we're facing. And I'm joined today by Theo Della Bosca, who is the Development Director on a couple of major projects in Victoria, including Burwood Brickworks, where we're going to spend most of our time. Hello, Theo.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with this. This is an amazing site, and I think that's worth at least spending a bit of time on. I'd love you to tell us a bit about what makes it special and I guess give us a broad sense of what you're planning to do there.
The site's unique in as much as it's a 20-hectare infill site in the middle suburbs of Melbourne. Those opportunities don't come along very often, and I guess practically it's proximate to really great amenity in terms of transport and education and facilities generally. So for Frasers, it presents as an opportunity to deliver a fantastic mixed-use development on the site, incorporating retail and residential, and delivering on some community outcomes which benefit to the wider community, not just the residents who will be moving into the project.
Yeah. There's a fascinating kind of quirk of history about this site, I think.
Yes.
So I was recently in the Melbourne office of Frasers.
Yep.
And as you know, at the top of the stairs, there are a series of subdivision kind of maps that date back to the 1930s and 40s and 50s. That Australand, which preceded Frasers and in fact some other businesses that were part of that, actually developed. And when you look at those suburbs, you see Box Hill, Camberwell, Blackburn, suburbs that are really that kind of patchwork of the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, where the quarter-acre block and the Aussie dream kind of was born.
Correct.
Now, the fascinating irony is that this site, which was a brickworks, I believe I found this out today, in the 1930s it was acquired for £3,000. Mm-hmm. And it made a brick called New Brick, which I think is still around today and is very famous. But this piece I read said it was the creams, reds and tans, in terms of colour, that became the sort of the fabric of what the streetscape looked like.
Correct. And the Burwood Blue is a very famous sort of brick in Melbourne in terms of construction of houses and still used today.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And the thing that I think is so interesting is that I think there's a portion of people who sort of grieve this Australian dream. You know, that, families can't afford this quarter-acre block anymore and it's gone away. And yet when I look at the plan for Burwood, I don't think you can avoid the reality that it's actually something better. Like, I think it represents something better because it's a walkable community. It's got access to lots of things. It's got shopping and retail. I'd love you to comment on what you think of this kind of irony that this site itself was part of this old version of the Australian dream, and yet now it becomes perhaps an exemplar of the new one.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the experience of living in the suburbs is certainly changing, and I guess that's reflective of the modern reality in terms of how we live our lives, our desires with regard to after hours activities and the economics of actually owning a house. So for that reason, the site of Burwood is completely reflective of that new direction, practically.
Yeah, tell us about the kind of integration of density, retail. How have you gone about that?
So I guess from a master planning point of view, central to the whole plan has been the inclusion of a retail precinct within the project, which delivers great amenity to the residents who will ultimately be living in that estate, and also to the residents of the sort of wider community. And I think the retail catchment extends out to sort of 100,000 households practically. So then in terms of the planning for the site, obviously that's an anchor, and then we necessarily need to build our density around that amenity. And so I guess the plan has a concentration of higher density apartment developments around the retail shopping centre, and then as you move further away, you move into a more sort of nuanced medium density townhouse outcome with varying densities across the site depending on where which stage it is and how it relates to the open space amenity which we're delivering across the balance of the site.
And the shopping centre itself is obviously very unique in terms of what it's aspiring towards. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
So at the end of the day, it'll be a 13,000 square metre shopping centre with a number of specialty shops, 40 plus, the usual sort of anchor tenants, Woolworths, Dan Murphy's. But I think what makes it unique is what Frasers has set about to achieve with regard to the sustainability story on the site. And Frasers is chasing living building certification on the project, which will necessarily require that in terms of the built form outcome, it achieves a very high hurdle in terms of sustainable outcomes, in terms of net energy production on site, so being basically responsible for providing all its energy needs on site, minimising the any sort of effluent or sort of stormwater going off site, so capturing water and using that as part of the premise, the building practice more generally and how the shopping centre is delivered in terms of the materials and inputs that form the construction of the shopping centre. And then I guess, from a practical point of view, there's the Living Building Challenge talks about the production of agriculture and the incorporation of the urban farm as part of the retail offering, which is a rooftop agricultural activity from which agricultural produce is derived for the use in the shops and premises within the shopping centre. And I guess the the food waste from those shops are actually then used in terms of compost for the agricultural activity on site. So
it's an amazing thing. So that, as I understand it, it will, in the end, likely be the world's most sustainable shopping centre.
That's the ambition, practically.
And so for the consumer, what you're talking about is obviously there's a whole lot of things that sit underneath of that. This place will actually feel different, won't it? I mean, there's a farm on the rooftop. There's no doubt there'll be this sort of biophilic design where there's greenery sort of, oozing out of the insides. And,
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be an extraordinary thing to experience, I think.
And I guess every time I sort of talk to anybody about the retail outcome on the site and the project more generally, I keep referencing back to the Abbotsford Convent in Melbourne, which is a fairly unique experience for a metropolitan Melbourne residents, in as much as by visiting that site you're exposed to agricultural activities and community-based programs which you don't get anywhere else. It's a really unique environment. So in a similar way, the Burwood Brickworks, to my mind, is going to deliver the same outcome in as much as we're offering a unique story from a sustainability point of view in terms of the agricultural proposal, which is part of the final design, the biophilic design, as you mentioned, the community programs, which will basically run out of the retail shopping centre, and the urban plaza, which sits on its forecourt, because there's going to be a 5,000 square metre urban plaza, which sits on the doorstep of the retail shopping centre, out of which is meant to be run a program of community-based activities which are not just for the benefit of local residents but for the wider community more generally.
Yeah. The Abbotsford Convent one is such a great example because, I mean, that is one of Melbourne's great places,
iconic,
right? To spend a beautiful weekend afternoon. But one of the things that makes it so great, I think, is that it's a bit rough around the edges. It's got this sort of authenticity about it that is born out of the fact probably that it runs as a non-profit on the smell of an oily rag.
Yep.
How do you as a developer, where, you're working, well, certainly probably with larger budgets, but more importantly, the way of a developer is usually nice, clean, straight lines and polish.
Yep.
How do you kind of deal with those two realities, given that as human beings we tend to gravitate towards places that feel a little bit less finished?
Oh, I think you're right. In the first instance, that'll be the outcome that's delivered. But practically, with the passage of time, the centre and the community more generally it'll take on its own character. It'll get its own sort of patina, and it'll just naturally evolve as the landscape becomes established. The community becomes established. People's habits become established. It'll develop its own character.
I love that word, patina. It's such a great way of describing what happens, isn't it? Because there is that funny period I've often noticed with development, right? So you deliver a project and it looks smashing.
Yes.
5 years later, the developer's often out of town.
Yes.
That's the reality, is we've moved on to other projects. And there's sometimes that middle period where it all feels a bit soulless. And then 20 years later, it's got an amazing feeling because it's lived in. Are there things that you can do to try and sort of, I guess, accelerate that patina developing?
Look, I think sort of fundamentally with the planning for the site, I mean, what's paramount in our mind is making sure that, first and foremost, we're delivering a quality outcome. And, the success of that outcome will engender a lot of sort of buy-in from the community. People will be proud of the environment. There's no question about, how exceptional this space is, because it's going to be exceptional from one corner of the site to the other.
Yeah.
I guess no better example of that than, apart from the retail shopping centre, there's the whole program we're delivering with regard to the development of civic spaces through the site, because as I mentioned, there's a 5,000 square metre urban plaza which sits on the doorstep of the retail shopping centre, but it does more than that. It actually ties into the apartment developments which are immediately adjacent, and there's a program of retail from one side of the urban plaza to the other, so that ties the two elements together. And then beyond that, there's a seamless integration of the open space from the site, because on the back door of the retail shopping centre there's a massive shotcrete retaining wall which is about 290 metres long, which could have presented a the most hideous Vic Roads engineered outcome. But thankfully, we've managed to, with our project team, come up with a stunning backdrop for the retail shopping centre, and also the apartments which, look directly out onto this, whereby we've got this beautifully nuanced and detailed 8-metre high retaining wall with landscaping forward of it, and it's just not going to be an ugly Vic Roads outcome. But it starts there and it works its way through the urban plaza, down the linking space, into the central open space. So it's one considered whole, and that goes to the architecture and the way we've approached the delivery of the architecture, making sure we've got top-grade design team on board. They've been given the freedom to, come up with the right outcome for the site. And,
It must, I guess your job really is to try and keep at a reasonably high level so you're able to see the entire site while then diving into the detail. Is that a reasonable?
Correct.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I guess it's, you'd say sort of conductor or sort of, if you're looking at an orchestra, you sort of, all the moving parts, trying to make sure they all come together in a seamless way and, without too many surprises so, programs don't get missed.
Yeah, exactly. So the Andrews government here in Victoria has just announced a very ambitious orbital rail program, which I noted had a stop in Burwood.
Oh, I missed that.
Yeah, so
fantastic.
I wonder what the chance of a direct entrance into our shopping centre from.
I think we need to start lobbying. Let's go.
So on that note, it's a very rare thing to have a site of this size
Correct.
in the middle of an area as close to the city. I mean, it's we call it a middle ring suburb, but
Yep.
A development of this size is a very rare thing, which of course means that the planning process, which always would have been difficult, is particularly challenging, I guess. Tell us about how that has played out. Because this has been a long time coming, this project.
Oh, no doubt. And I guess, the challenges on the site are numerous. And I guess in the first instance, there's the physical characteristics of the site, which has made our project partner, Whitehall City Council, quite anxious because it was formerly a quarry.
Right.
300,000 cubic metres of fill have been imported and settled. And I guess council's had some adverse experience with subsidence on other sites previously, so that's made them necessarily very cautious.
So I understand. Effectively, they're worried about sink.
Correct. They're worried about I guess they're worried that we're going to spend $500 million developing this and it's all going to fall in a hole.
Right.
Of course, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
But I do understand their concerns. So I guess that sort of sets the sort of framework. And then beyond that, practically the site actually acts as a massive retarding basin as well, because we pick up catchment upstream and we've got to detain on site 10,000 cubic metres of stormwater. So there's some heavy engineering constraints which, impact on how this site's necessarily going to be delivered. So then I guess that sets the context for the whole planning process. And I guess, to your point, a rare opportunity in a middle ring. Council's maybe not experienced with dealing with a project of this scale, this nature. And so I guess the process of approval has not been straightforward. And I guess, my arrival on the project was sort of a little way in after we'd gone through the rezoning, but the development plan was just about to be approved. And council had, with the approval of that development plan, were very anxious about, particularly, we had proposed a lake in the middle of the site.
Right.
So we had to unpack the master plan, go through a replanning process, and it's fair to say that in terms of trying to get outcomes through council, things weren't just happening in a timely enough manner for us. So that necessitated us, unfortunately, but the right outcome for the project, taking them out of the VCAT to have it independently determined. And I think since we've gone through that process of taking it to VCAT, at least everybody's now got buy-in, lines been drawn on the sand, permits are coming out, but we've still got the lingering issues of approvals and, having to work through issues with council and, trying to, it's very detailed is what I'd say.
Yeah. It seems to me that in these middle ring suburbs, we're already seeing it it's a little further into the city, that while developments on this scale will be very rare,
yes,
moving from medium and low density to high density and possibly cobbling together lots of blocks to do that, and that seems to be quite inevitable. And how do you think local councils in general are placed to respond to what will be pretty significant change to the landscape of the way that our suburbs look and feel?
I don't think they're very well positioned at all.
No.
Unfortunately. That's the reality of it because, it's a tight employment market right now. The development, industry is very busy. I guess I feel for council because obviously, we're a large-scale developer and I guess we're not as inclined to go to VCAT as readily as, the smaller scale developers. So I guess council, they often find themselves in VCAT trying to defend cases. And I guess, practically that's having, material impact with Burwood because, their attention or focus has been drawn away regularly. So I feel for council because it's a very hot market and the issues are the practice of planning is becoming so much more complicated with the regularly changing, policies from, state government, local government, federal government, whatever it might be, your announcement with, Daniel Andrews with, Orbital, whatever. It just keeps going. Where do you stop? And then there's the local politics and so I guess it's not easy.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? It all probably has always been this way to a degree, but, you can't help but escape that reality when you look at those subdivision plans at the top of the stairs in the office, go, gosh, that was a simpler time.
Well, it was because my background is that I was actually a town planner and for a point in time I did work in local government.
Yeah.
And I remember that when I was working in local government, the ordinance was relatively thin. Nowadays, the ordinance is just, phenomenally, detailed and it's, in terms of negotiating your way around it, it is not straightforward at all.
It is interesting, isn't it? And I guess one of the things about Burwood is even though in the end it won't have been an easy process, the outcome is extraordinary. It's like for our office, for example, sits on the edge of the Paran car park. I don't know if you know that project in Stonington, where it's a very large car park that was serviced both a Woolworths and a Coles.
Yes.
The council took a very brave decision to basically deck it over, put 2 levels underground, and they're putting an enormous urban plaza there. Anyway, we just happened to be involved in it because we sit on the edge of it, and I know that both Woolworths and Coles are in the courts with council because in the building process they've lost so much revenue. But again, I look at it and go, well, these are just the costs of great things. And this to me seems like a great project, as does Burwood. And in the end, hopefully everybody will look back and go, well, those were 4 difficult years of planning, but we got there.
And that's the practical reality.
Yeah.
You need to be able to put it in perspective. You need to judge the risk-return profile for what it is, make a decision, move on to get the right outcome because, you could be sort of, deliberating and sort of cogitating for years and achieve nothing.
So the other thing or the final thing I want to ask you about is we've talked a lot about the overall scope of the site, its history, the planning process. Tell me about the way that you think about the human dimension of what you're designing for. This site will obviously be home to people. It will be a destination for shopping. I would expect it will be a community asset and a destination. How do you think about the people who will use it and make sure that they're part of the design process?
Interesting question. I guess every day, everything we do is about putting the customer first, practically. So every decision we make is about putting the customer at the centre of it at a sort of a macro level, looking at the spaces which we're creating, understanding how people, will occupy those spaces, move through those spaces, how the buildings which fringe those spaces interact with it.
Yeah.
And then the buildings which themselves, how they actually function in terms of, their livability, their usability, the amenity which we deliver as part of those offers, and I guess, their aesthetic qualities, and then I guess, beyond that, as I mentioned, there's the community program, which, we proposing, will be at the centre of everything that we do.
Yeah.
And, I guess there's a process we're just about to embark on with council about, understanding what the programs are that we might be able to run out of. We've got a community space which we're delivering as part of the retail shopping centre. So how we build that sense of community on the site and in the wider community.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it goes so much to sort of human behaviour, and I wonder over the years, because you've obviously got enormous experience in this. Are there any sort of golden rules that you've sort of kind of come across around how to design for the kind of best social outcomes? I'm always struck by the kind of classic European piazza.
Yes.
And the way that there's just something about that ground floor retail with apartments above and the fountain in the middle and the cobblestones that seems to create this electricity between human beings. And the question, of course, is that because it's been there for 150 years, or is there something fundamental to its design that, as developers, it's worth taking note of? I'm interested in your thoughts on this, because you must come across these sort of decisions every day as the project takes shape.
Yeah, and I think those examples that you cite are fantastic and relevant. But of course, practically the character of those spaces have evolved over centuries and millennia or whatever. I guess to your point before, we're talking about something which is fresh and new. In terms of getting the planning right, yes, those aspects need to be reasonably considered to make sure that longer term they do thrive and prosper and work as you would expect.
There's a sort of irony, isn't there? Because I think most of us maybe not most of us, but plenty of us would think about that idea of, wouldn't it be wonderful to live in one of those Parisian, squares? And whereas if you think about it in practical terms, nobody wants to live in an apartment directly above a restaurant with a loud, bustling street scene below, And so if you, in the Burwood context, it's all appropriately separated. And yet the question is, does that diminish the character because the human beings are not as close to one another?
In terms of the Burwood experience, obviously all aspects of it have been very well considered in terms of delivering the right outcome to ensure that the experience of the occupant is optimal practically.
Yeah.
So I think I've got my head right now on the space of a resident in an apartment looking out on the retail shopping centre in the urban plaza below with a cafe downstairs, and just thinking about what their life will be. And and I'm confident that through the process that we've gone with our design team, that their experience will be exceptional. There is no question about that. And, your example of the European plaza, that's sort of redolent in my mind. I can almost sort of smell the sort of coffee and feel the vibe. But I guess, practically in terms of delivering those outcomes, there's a modern day reality of dealing with the local planning issues on the ground, which are, many and varied, which dictate outcomes. So we're going through that process now in terms of trying to, finesse the outcome on the urban plaza. And I guess, we've got a vision, but council's got to share that vision.
It's the very definition of having to balance, these varying inputs, a bit of pragmatism, but at the same time keeping the vision alive. I mean, It's not an easy thing to do, is it? And
not at all.
Yeah, but where you sit today, you feel like this is going to be the project that manages to sort of do that to a very high degree.
I mean, my and the team's very strong desire, and the business's very strong desire is to sort of shoot the lights out practically. And I hold true to that, and every day we sort of fight for that outcome. So, as best we can.
Yeah. Tell me about that fight. How do you, as a leader of that team, keep it alive? Because I've seen this on the Burwood project. It's been a long period of planning uncertainty, and I think it's an amazing thing that the team remains so committed to this outcome. And have you had to actively manage that? Oh, look,
I consider myself incredibly lucky. I work in a fantastic organisation with a fantastic team, with a fantastic group of consultants working around me. So we're all, passionate and motivated. Yes, from time to time we get dispirited and demoralised, but it's about celebrating your successes, breaking down, the issues, looking for solutions, putting it in perspective, trying to drive forward. And to my point I made before about, at some point in time, you just got to make a decision, look at the risk return, make a decision, move on, bang. We need to get there.
Yeah, exactly right. But I guess the advantage of being within a business like Frasers is that need to get there isn't so urgent
No.
that you can't sometimes stop and go, no, we need to.
No, because all that, as I said before, in all of that decision making, the customer is at the centre of it. In my mind, the customer is absolutely centre of it, and to me that says the best design outcome that we can practically deliver. Managing risk return, budget, all of those sorts of things.
So let's finish where we started, which is to that point around the customer at the centre of it. Nearly 100 years ago, when this site was bought, not quite, but nearly. We were about to begin this great Australian expansion of quarter-acre blocks and freestanding homes and the rest of it. And now that customer that you're describing, who years ago would have bought one of those, is probably considering something like a townhome in Burwood. Tell me about how you see that evolution and I guess why it makes sense.
Well, I guess, practically suburbs, communities go through cycles and, people age in place. And I guess with the launch of the project recently, I was having many conversations with local residents about exactly that situation and they're looking for alternatives. And so, I was grateful at the very least we're able to provide alternatives, whether it be for themselves or for their kids who they wanted to keep in the area. Or even, I guess by extension to the Ryman Healthcare side of the top of the hill. That's been incorporated as part of our project as well. So we've got a sort of cradle to grave offer on the site, which is fantastic. So, it's very rare that those opportunities come along. I
think there was a wonderful story, wasn't there, that one of Frasers' oldest salespeople brought his mum along. Did you hear that story?
Oh, no, I didn't.
Yeah, so I believe that one of the first apartments was sold to the mother of a long-standing sales member of Frasers. I think she was downsizing from a freestanding home into something that was much more suited to that lifestyle. And I guess the barrow that I'm pushing a little bit here is I'm starting to question whether the great Australian dream was ever quite right in the first place, because it wasn't suited to all different life stages. And it, in some cases, created that scenario of lonely old widowers, sitting alone at home, feeling disconnected from the community versus that kind of connectivity that is enabled by higher levels of density. Yeah,
you're right. But I think, also it was right for a point in time, the 50s with a suburban expansion, I guess, we yearned for it. It was part of our reality. Now there's just a different reality.
Yeah.
So,
and my hope, and I do think this will happen, is that there will be a whole generation of people who yearn for something different, which is that electricity of what it feels like to live in a place where there's things happening. And Burwood is, to me, the exemplar of that.
Yeah, there's absolutely no doubt about that. Yeah. I mean, the way we live our lives nowadays is not the way that we lived our lives 40 years ago. It's very fast paced. It's very sort of dynamic. It's and I guess our lifestyles and hence our accommodation needs to reflect that outcome. We're all sort of looking for more value in our lives, and it's about providing those spaces and environments which give people that little bit more that they're looking for, which is, not the dormitory suburb.
Exactly right. Well, Theo, that's great. It's been a good conversation.
Pleasure.
And I thank you very much.
All right. Fantastic. Thanks for having me.